All right. So tonight, I want to go over, like we just did, your current projects, the vessel, the revolved vessel projects. But what I want to make sure to do is talk about how to go about 3D printing them, because 3D printing these, you're going to end up needing to use supports. And in supports it's called a bunch of things, but normally it's called supports or scaffolding, depending on the program. Usually it's supports. But you can think of supports as like a scaffolding. If you're seeing a building getting constructed, they put scaffolding around so the workers can stand around, and that helps the tiny micro elves build the thing in the print. No, I'm just kidding. Now that what that does, it just supports the thing as it's being made. And in this case, in this 3D printers, the supports give support for material because it's getting, in this case, like for the extrusion printers, and it does the same thing for the resin printers. Obviously, it can't print in space. Gravity exists. So in order for certain things to cool in time, it needs support. If it's designed in a certain way, you can adjust like angles and fillets and things like that and adjust things to where there won't be what's called an overhang, which an overhang is essentially something is going upwards and it hangs out. Say this is a solid object from this side over. It can print fine up to a point, but if this angle is too shallow and falls way too far out, as the slicer program functions and as the filament gets extruded, it's fine up to a point. And if this is too shallow, the filament will simply just not stick and just fall off. In that case, that's where supports come in. Essentially, and literally, the printer will also create layers of scaffolding and help support it at that point, and the print can continue on its way. This is especially important if something like you're building and it has like an actual inverted overhang. Well, that would be fine if it was printed the other way around, but because of the way that the printer functions, it's going to hit that tip before it makes the connection points. So it has to have scaffolding there because it can't just deposit material floating in space yet. There are some really cool advances coming in that, and some places have developed things that can print basically in like a suspension gel, and it just holds it in space, and the gel is just like a water soluble thing. Anyway, supports get designed built into, and it literally supports what it's doing. So let's figure out what that really means. So let me change my screen back over to Fusion, jumping over to our revolve vessel. Now, in order to print these, you do want to make sure to export these as separate objects. So don't select both objects at once. The reason for that is often Fusion will grab them as one solid object, especially if they are in fact touching. It will treat them as one object. Or more importantly, you cannot move them around separately on the building plate. So even if you have modeled the thing and it is floating in space above the two things are literally floating in space from one another, the slicer program will only stack them. You can't move them around like that. So it's important that you select these separately. So you can select just the entire object in this case, or you could expand out and select the body or click on the body, similar diff. So I'll go there. We'll go to 3D print, since sometimes export for some reason can cause a little bit of a delay. So I'll just go to 3D print. Does the exact same thing. In this case, I'm going to leave it as the STL. I don't need to, oops, I accidentally selected the preview mesh. Preview mesh just creates a preview of what a meshed object would look like. And that makes it a lot more complex. Don't need it. In this case, I do want to change the refinement to high, because as the program translates your three-dimensional rounded object, digitally, rounded objects are an expression of shorter and ever shorter straight edges. High refinement means there's a lot more little straight edges. That's all. Don't forget to deselect the checkbox that says send to 3D print utility. Go out there. Oh, I can't spell apparently. Planter. We use that. Select one, it exports, select the other one, double click, select the other one, 3D print, saves all my stuff. Great. And tray. Already exists. Yes, override it. All right. So let me, oops, change over to my slicer program. And again, in this case, I'm using the PRUSA slicer. There's other options, but because we're pretty much using this PRUSA printers, might as well use this. Remember, you can drag and drop stuff over. So in this case, I'm just going to literally drag, plop it in place, pretty big. Now, in this case, if you realize or decide that this is much too large, you can always, too many things. You can always make this large, or you can always scale these things down. But this is about the size we wanted to be able to print at, because I want to be able to print this at like a size that you can actually use. All right, so first off, these are inhabiting the same space. That can't happen. Hit the auto arrange button, and it's going to move them around your plater. All right, cool. That's pretty good. So just with the default settings, currently at draft settings, so 0.3 millimeter slicing layers, I am selecting my PETG filament. Remember, you can select whatever you want. Just make sure that's what you intend to use. And double check that you have the original Mark III selected. Should be the only option on your slicer, but there you are. Now, I'm going to show you a couple other things in a moment, but I want to show you what happens first. So go to Slice Now, and it goes Slicing Now. Creating my infill layers, all that fun. And it looks all wobbly because it's giving me an actual rendering of the layers themselves, of the actual layers of the filament extrusions as they will come out. So pretty neat. Now, looking up at the legend, though, blue is the overhang. That's where you might run into problems. So looking at like the dish here, it's pretty shallow in that you'll probably be able to get away with it. It might look a little rough in your print, but you should be able to get away with it. If I zoom back out, looks good, looks good. All the sides look good. However, I can see something peeking out from underneath. This is where a problem is going to come in. Now, in this case, I have what is essentially a flat spot, and it is saying a bridge infill. That lighter blue is a bridging area. What that means is exactly what it sounds. You have 2 points sticking up on your print, and it will have to try to create a bridge between those 2 points. Now, if you were just printing something straight right across, no problem. Problem is, this is round, and it's going to try to create rings around, anything like that. Now, this might be okay. Might even be okay if I were to dial down the print settings, meaning go to draft. I could maybe go to 0.2 millimeters for speed, reslice, see what that looks like. Sometimes because of the thickness of the layer height, sometimes it kind of generates more problems than it might have otherwise. In this case, it looks like it's about the same. So that's going to be an issue. So how to fix that, in this case, is you would add supports. And I'm going to go back to draft setting just because I want to use that in this case. Just recalculate real quick. All right. Your supports option is the next drop down. You have 3 general support options. You have support from build plate only, meaning it will only create things straight from the build plate. Self-explanatory. Makes a lot more sense if you have a more complex object. Essentially something that had a side profile that maybe first was wide, then went narrow, and then went wide again. If it were wider out further, what it would do is it would generate supports from the build plate only, meaning it would only create supports straight up. But the next option is support reinforcement. That's going to help if you have like a weird overhang or so. We'll try it. We'll see what it looks like. The other one is support everywhere, and that is exactly what it sounds like. It will create supports on top of your model as well as outside so that it can get the maximum amount of support it needs. So in this case, let's try what happens with just build supports on build plate only. The other option is your infill. For what we're making, how thin the walls are, infill is the generated, and I know we talked about this before, but basically the infill is the generated support model between the walls of your model. There's a bunch of different types of patterns. In this case, 20% is, or the percentage is just from 0, which is hollow entirely, to 100%, which is solid. You do not need that at all. 20% is actually really quite good. Even 15% you can get away with. 15%, it's just going to recalculate, that's all. But let's try it from build support, or support on build plate only. All right, now, first thing is, what the heck? Why am I getting an error thing? Everything, the world just went orange. Well, that is because when I added the build supports, it ekes just over the side. Now, this is an issue that you run into because you've used the auto placement. It's not a bad thing. It's just sometimes it can be an issue. So what that means is, since I use the auto range, I might need to instead arrange these a little bit more carefully by hand. So what I can do, move this out over a little bit, and maybe that means move this over a little bit more. So, unfortunately, this perspective view isn't a true perspective view instead of an orthogonal view like our CAD software. So I'm not really getting a true visual of what I'm seeing. It's quite accurate, but you can see how there's some deformation as you look down. But let's see how that goes. Error, toolpath outside. Yeah. Let's see what it does. Trying to get the go away. All right, see, I move things around. Now it's all inside the build area. All right. So the other thing is, you can see, obviously, holy crap, that's a lot of supports. Now I can use a slider and cut down and see how close the supports are. And you can see that as I get down lower, it's really just a ring around the edge. It's not like it's completely solid. So that's not a bad thing. So you have a couple of options. One, you could go back in your actual model and change the profile of that vessel. So what you could basically do, let me go back to Fusion. I could simply adjust my sketch to bring this lip a little bit more vertical. That's all. It's a pretty quick fix. That's an easy one to do. But in this case, I really like that profile. So instead, let's go back to Slicer. And what I can do is I can try to minimize the amount of material it's going to use. Now, the thing is, supports, it actually extrudes a thinner, smaller amount of material. So it's not like the walls of these supports are nearly as strong or thick as the walls of your actual model. So in all reality, it's not like it's using a great deal of material, but you can quickly see if it's basically having to make a second full vessel, it goes through a lot of material, or rather, it wastes a lot of material. It's quite thin. Again, we don't have reclamation options right now, but working on that. So that's my concern. So if you wanted to try to dial that back, you can adjust that. So we're going to go to print settings. So far, we've played a bit with infill, where you can change the fill density, and also if you like the different patterns. In this case, the walls are so thin, it really doesn't matter. I like to use the gyroid pattern. It's a little bit more efficient, I think, but in something like this, it's not going to make a big difference. But keep going down to the other orange showing one is support material. This is where you could make some adjustments. One, the overhang threshold. This is where it automatically detects how far an overhang really is until it can print. And honestly, you could dial this down a bit. And we could probably get a little bit more out of this. Honestly, I think we could mess with this and get a little more leeway. The other option is, let's minimize the amount of space between the patterns on the supports. So if I go down to pattern spacing here, default is 2 millimeters. So it's 2 millimeters, and it makes another zigzag back and forth. I've often used like 5 or 6. Excuse me, in this case, let's use 6. So right now that I've made that change, yeah, things disappear. Don't worry about it. Go to slice now. Ugh, I'm gonna have to move stuff around again. Oh, because it made that just slightly larger. Ah, you pain. Now, if you run into this to where your model is just too large, you may have to work this down. But one other thing we can adjust is, you see this little footing here? That's not really necessary. That's what's called a brim. And in this case, that's another one of the print settings. Let's go to support material. And where is, I always forget. Oh, one between skirt and brim. You can turn that down. Like if that's what's messing with you, you can do like no brim at all. It's not really a necessary option. So if that's what's just eking over the work area, reslice. Still doing it. I'll be. Oh, that's irritating, because what's stepping out of bounds is just this little tiny line right here. So that's what's messing with us, and it's just eking over. So let's try. I'm gonna have to move this around again. Ultimately, if you run into this too much, it just won't work. You might just have to print these separately. And if that's the case, well, there you go. I'll try it a little bit more. It'll stay green while I'm moving it. If I do move it outside, it'll go blue. So it's not like you're just eyeballing it, hoping for the best. It does warn you. All right, let's try it one more time. Yeah, it's still doing it. All right. Tell you what, in this case, oh, wait, no, recalculated. Hey, it fit. All right, there we go. So sometimes, and that's what I mean, but sometimes you can't just rely on the automatic settings. Sometimes you have to tweak it yourself. But I changed this pattern spacing. So now when I slice down through here, or when I pull the slider through, you can see as I zoom in, the pattern spacing for the supports is much, much larger. So I'm going to be using a lot less material. So that's one way. If you're concerned about that, realistically, what we had already on there was probably fine, but this will be the case. But last thing I want you to note is, holy crap, does that add time to the estimated printing time? This whole form, just my cup and dish, 14.5 hours. That's not a reflection on how much material it's using. It's really using very little material, but it's using a lot of time. So if that's the case, if that's what we're running into, let's go and try to change the overhang perimeters. So I'm going to go back to no supports. If I slice this now, note the time change. 8 hours. That's a pretty big change. So I'm going to go back to that support material. I'm going to go over to the overhang threshold. Auto generate supports. Yep. Why is this not letting me change stuff now? Oh, because if it's not letting you make selections, it's because I'm on the preview option. Go back to the editor option. Yeah, I hate that it makes you do stuff like that. Why is it not doing it now? Before it was fine. Oh, because I turned off supports, of course, duh. So in other words, I took off the supports. There we are. If I leave the supports on, that's where it's going to be. Sorry about that. So really, you could change this around. 90 degrees is vertical. It says default value is 0. So I'm curious what happens if we change that to 0. Plater. Yeah, it's freaking out big time now. Oh no, same deal. So it's detecting the same thing. So in all reality, it's a lot of times it's going to come down to what you really feel comfortable with. It will technically print this. It might just be a little goobery at this overhang. That's not a big overhang. It's not a steep angle. Down here at the bottom of my dish, that might be a little bit of an issue. I might do well to kind of flatten that out just a touch. But for the most part, this is going to be okay. The real issue area is going to be underneath here. And how to fix something like that, where I was running into, it was wanting to, it was telling me that's a big overhang issue area. That would be an area to go back into Fusion and adjust, change back over to Fusion. That would be an area to go back and adjust this bottom here. And you got two options. You can either make that fillet that I added there a lot bigger or a lot smaller. A lot bigger, and that arc won't be nearly as small and steep. It'll actually be much closer to the whole thing, and you'll be able to just kind of arc over. Or make it smaller, and the area that it's going to have to try to create a bridge for is much smaller. So if I dial it way back, even to a point, that might actually be slightly more effective. So that's the real issues there. Main thing, if you run into areas and it looks like, be that you want to save on either time or material by either using or not using supports, you can go back and change your model. If you want to try to minimize the amount of time that you have to have supports for, you can mess with the spacing on your pattern spacing, as well as like your brim layer. But honestly, the brim, like we just saw, really didn't help much of it all. So I would just not bother with that. It's more of just being able to adjust the spacing on the pattern of your supports. So anyway, I know that's a lot to throw at you, But there's a variety of ways you can approach problems like this, and those are some of them. The one other option you have, in this case, it's not going to help, but other times it might be, rearrange your object, not just flat here, but sometimes best thing to do is tilt an object. Now, a large thing like this, not so much. You can use the place on face option if you want to completely invert something. I'm going to select there and it flips it completely over. Now, problem with this is it's going to try to create supports all inside. Oh, except for I selected no supports. So you can see how much of that now, that entire flat spot up there is an overhang area, and that's really going to mess it all up. But the bottom will look nice. So that would be the case of, all right, no, flip it right side up. The other option could sometimes be, instead of flipping something flat, pardon me, rotate it at an odd angle. Now, in this case, I won't be able to use that at all, but sometimes floating an object like this will help. In this case, this would create some really bad problems. Like, I would still have to, obviously, I'm gonna have to use supports for something like this. And you can see what ends up happening. It has to create this whole area here. But you can get some interesting results from rotating objects like this, to where you can play around with the actual filament patterning. As you can see that now, instead of let's kind of go a little cross-eyed looking at that, you can see that as the layer slicing happens, it's not flat perpendicular in line with the object. You can create actual diagonal slices and stuff like that. So there's a lot of fun ways you can play with this, but in all reality, the best thing to do is, if you can manage it, try to minimize the amount of supports you need. Oops. Simply because it's going to add time and a lot of material to it. If you have to have supports, minimize the actual pattern spacing and stuff like that, unless you have a super detailed object which needs a lot of support. That's really it. So in this case, it looks like I'll be able to get away with printing this object as it is. And at least I'll shave like, a good 8 hours off of its print time. And unfortunately, with supports, there's not a lot of wiggle room otherwise. If you have to have supports, it can add a lot of print time. But the question there comes, do you want the print to be as clean as possible? If then let it run for that long and it'll print some more supports, and there you go. But in this case, I think we can get away with it. Print that and make a nice little vessel to plant with. In this case, like I said, we're going to ignore them. And it'll print it just like that. Might have a little bit of goobery things underneath, but if you go back, make some changes to your original model, you can maybe eliminate that. So hope that helps. Good luck with your prints.